So, what we're talking about today is the rhetorical triangle and how to create your rhetorical analysis about the rhetorical triangle. So, of course, you're familiar with the rhetorical triangle, I would assume, with speaker, audience, and topic, and how, of course, different elements relate to those speaker, audiences, and topics. So, for instance, with speaker, audience, and topic, you have the correlating logos, ethos, and pathos. So it's important to understand, of course, how those relationships exist when we're looking at how any rhetorical situation connects to the audience from the speaker. So when we want to detail this here and help you understand how to analyze it, we can start by looking at that relationship between the speaker and the audience based on choices that are made by the speaker. So if we write down here speaker to establish who is speaking, of course, and then up at the top, on the side, we establish choices, that every rhetorical decision should be a choice toward that audience who's up at the top. So this is, again, just using those same elements you've learned already, but changing up the structure for that. So it's about how those speakers' choices affect the audience, related, of course, to a topic, and how that topic exists for the audience, between the speaker and the audience, and the purpose through which they're making this rhetorical circumstance. And of course, purpose isn't written down here. So the place to start here with related to speaker is the fact that you have rhetorical elements established by the speaker. And at the base level, there's what we call diction. And diction is just a fancy word for word choice. And of course, that's the base level that a speaker uses if it's obviously verbal or written situation. And diction has two parts to it: connotations and denotations. Now, again, diction just means word choice, so it's just what words you're choosing to get to a reader. But connotations are the feelings associated with the word, and denotations are the literal dictionary definition. So, for instance, a connotation for something might be the dark and stormy sidewalk. And by using words like dark and stormy to describe sidewalk, it creates a feeling that is different than the literal feeling of a sidewalk, which to most people is no feeling whatsoever. It's just a sidewalk. So it's really important to understand how diction then separates between the connotations of each word and the denotations of each word, because that dictates a lot how the reader will feel about those different words, or the audience will feel about those different words. And because of those feelings, your speaker is creating a tone for the audience. And the tone is felt by the audience in what we call mood. The reader experiences a mood, and the speaker creates that tone for the audience to experience. And that tone is really what establishes a lot of things about rhetoric, because we take from that how the situation is going to go related to the topic. So that tone could be scary, it could be positive, it could be humorous, it could be flirtatious, it could be all sorts of things. And to create that tone, we can't just throw a whole bunch of words out there and expect people to feel something. We have to use what's understood to be called syntax. Syntax, again, talking about fancy words here, is just a fancy word for your sentence choices. And so that involves, of course, phrases and clauses. And as we arrange our phrases and clauses into simple, compound, complex sentences, all that kind of stuff that you've hopefully learned in the past, that allows our our audience to understand our different tones, our different feelings, our different methods through which we're trying to convince them. And POS there doesn't stand for what you might think. It actually stands for parts of speech. So your nouns, your verbs, your adverbs, your adjectives, all those words create syntax. And all those words have connotations and denotations that create that tone for the audience. So that's your base level stuff. That's the stuff that's establishing a rhetorical analysis. Now that yellow marker is really gross and it's hard to see, but you have a couple options here, right? Even at this base level, you could do a rhetorical analysis that would be totally satisfactory. It'd be pretty limited because you'd only be talking about the syntax, the word choice, how it creates tone perhaps. So what we've established during class is that there are different ways that you can then analyze a piece of rhetoric, right? So based upon that tone, which is feelings, the easy one to think about first is pathos, because that's an emotional analysis. And again, we have that list of pathos analysis elements, and you could certainly look to those different elements for analyzing pathos, and you want to get specific there. You don't want to stay broad when it comes to pathos analysis. You want to be specific and talk about, for instance, maybe those needs that people have. Second of all, we have logos. And logos, again, evolves from the tone of the overall writing. It evolves from how the text is written. And logos is important because that actually gives the kind of valid reasons why the topic and what the speaker is saying about the topic is true. Now, of course, logos has the dangerous twin there of logical fallacies, and those logical fallacies can undermine the ethos of the speaker and how that speaker is ultimately trying to use those choices to convince that audience. And so the speaker has all these choices to say, am I going to use pathos? Am I going to use logos? Am I going to use logical fallacies? What is my audience like? And based on that audience, they have to make choices to maintain this idea of ethos. And ethos, as you see here from this orange drawing, has to be maintained throughout the whole discussion in order to convince the audience. Now, that'll depend on the audience whether or not ethos is challenging to maintain or easy. But from that point, you then get all these different choices. You can choose logos, pathos, logical fallacies, tone, syntax, all these different elements you can analyze about the topic to discuss whether or not the speaker is successful in convincing the audience about whatever topic it is. So this is to show you a lot of options you have to reassure yourself that you shouldn't feel limited in the opportunities you have to analyze the rhetoric of a given situation. Now, a more focused area we're going to look at are rhetorical devices. And rhetorical devices relate most closely to diction, purpose, and syntax. And rhetorical devices and choices, those are opportunities to frame your discussion to emphasize pathos, logos, and ethos. And there's specific statements about the phrasing and specific devices that you can choose that help to emphasize things like logos, pathos, and ethos. So you'll be seeing a list of all those rhetorical devices in the future and how they work. So bottom line is you have a lot of choices for a rhetorical analysis. There's so many different things you can utilize to talk about this whole process. And they're all available to you when you're making that rhetorical analysis. Don't feel limited. Now, generally, though, you don't want to stay too broad or too specific. For instance, you could write an essay that just talks about certain connotations of certain words within a certain area of a text. But that's really limited, and that could be very difficult to elaborate upon to make a meaningful analysis. Similarly, you could write just about logos and just about pathos, but try to focus it on those different elements I gave you in the graphic organizers to talk more specifically about logos and pathos. Please be clear, if you wrote just about logos broadly, it's going to be too broad. You want to focus in on something about logos. Similarly, with pathos, try to focus in on something. Don't just talk broadly about pathos or broadly about logical fallacies. Hone in on those certain devices, those certain strategies, those certain methods, and then explain why they work well or why they don't based upon the audience and based upon, again, that ethos that's established. And again, ethos you can break down as well. There's a lot of stuff there. There's a lot of different opportunities you have as someone analyzing rhetoric. So now it's your job as you read to try to figure out exactly what you see there and establish the best argument you can.